that system to continue, you need to have, between your car and your Tesla software developer, you need to have a device that is basically not fact checking, but like quality checking, the new software. And that's a big one because, everybody needs to be okay with that. And this is probably like one of the more central questions that we should ask ourselves as Europeans. Do we want that a US-based company is deciding which software is being deployed on a European car? And I think that's why we also need to make sure that like certification processes and these quality tests are being developed in Europe, and that we make sure whatever gets fed into this market, we want to have the last say over if it fits our quality standards.
Does any one of the other panelists want to react to these reflections by Joachim?
Yes, I've got a few. I've got a few.
Yes, Sebastian.
Thoughts on it. First of all, I very strongly want to agree with your point about setting the bar for safety and security from a European perspective. It's actually a matter of digital sovereignty as the new buzzword, whether we're able to do that, or whether we are going to have a situation that we had in the past, for example, with companies like Uber, like Facebook, like Airbnb, who went into the European market before European policymaking, regulation, standardization was in any way ready. They just did. They went into a huge grey area, established themselves, brought products into the market that gained a foothold. And if we want to avoid the same thing in AI, we have to be quick. And this doesn't come natural neither to regulation nor to standardization. Second point I'd like to make, just picking up on the first part of Joachim's introduction. He sort of jokingly said, well, as the SME, we wrote most of the standard. This is actually really an unusual situation because quite often it is large companies who can afford to send people into standardization bodies, and the risk is that standards then tend to reflect the interests of certain large companies. So I really want to encourage everyone who's on the call now from an SME perspective to take part in standardization activities, because it is the opportunity to shape the landscape into which you're going to sell your products. And as Joachim explained, it can actually generate a significant competitive advantage if you take part in that process. And if you invest the time and you write big parts of text, that is a strong influencing position. And I'd like to remind everyone that there's a EU program which has been relaunched just now called Standardization, which even provides grant for SME participation in standardization activities. So that is really, really important. And final point I'd like to make, also picking up on one of the things you said, Joachim, you quite rightly pointed out that human drivers are not perfect. For example, in Germany, we accept as a society that it's okay to have 3,000 dead per year on the roads, because we're saying, okay, yeah, it's a residual risk, but we accept that risk because of all the benefits that we see in having cars on the road and roads in the first place. But we don't have a consensus yet, and we don't even have a good discussion yet on what residual risk is acceptable for AI systems, what residual risk is acceptable for autonomous vehicles, or for AI-driven medical devices, or for any other AI application. And we really need that discussion. There is no right or wrong answer, whether we say, well, one day we might have all cars as autonomous cars. Is it still acceptable to have 3,000 dead per year? Or do we say, well, technology should be better than humans, so we only want 300, or we want none, or what is it? And that's not a decision that engineers or standardizers can make. it's a societal decision, and that discussion needs to start quite urgently.
Thank you, Sebastian. Before going to giving the floor to Lindsay, I think he wanted to say something. Let me just add something to what something you said about funding available for SMEs in standardization. Indeed, Stand ICT is an important program that is financed by the Commission and is providing finance to experts, not just SMEs, but also academia and other categories that are underrepresented in standardization. But this organization, SBS, is funded by the European Commission, and it is providing something at least about 700,000 euros per year to fund participation of SME experts in standardization. They now found about 60 experts who participate in different technical bodies, including George Sharkov, who was here before, and who's participating in CTC Cyber, if I remember correctly, representing SMEs.
So there are even two funding channels. So for everyone in this call, there's no more excuse.
No, absolutely. There are funding channels. It is possible. Of course, it's we all understand it's not easy, but it is possible. Lindsay, sorry, you probably wanted to react to Joachim's remarks as well, because you were raising your hand.
Just briefly, so now is probably the best and easiest time there ever was for SMEs to monitor and to interject in standardization, and including on AI, because all the meetings are now online. So like this one, and it works. So take advantage of it. The second thing is many of the discussions say, oh, AI should be tested, etc., etc. But in ITSE, we had many discussions that usually it's use case dependent. There's not much that you can say is going to be like a Band-Aid, you can put it on anything.
Yeah.
So really, people should, and even looking at risk analysis, it's always, as the example with the roads or the medical devices go, it's always dependent on the cost benefit for society and for the person. So people take very dangerous medicines to try to cure cancer, for example, and the risk of death from the medicine is actually quite high. So people still do it because the risk of dying from the cancer is even worse. So in all cases where conformity is considered, you should consider where it is going to be used. That is something I think we should take great care. Otherwise, we'll be blocking good results, which would be acceptable for some use cases, but of course unacceptable for others. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Alex, I don't know if you also wanted to react to the issues brought by Joachim.
Yeah, I mean, I guess very quickly, the thing that I think all of this ultimately comes down to is back to the risk management liability question, which is always going to drive the how much effort and how much resource to be put into certain things. But picking up, I think, on a couple of the points from some of the others, access to standards is, so if you look at the Chinese and others, what they do very, very well is enable their SMEs. If you look at their penetration into a lot of the markets, they're very, very good at that. So we have to get better in Europe. And as Lindsay says, we are, ironically, with COVID in the background, in the golden period of all of those meetings are online. So if SMEs are going to get involved, a lot of it is really, really cheap. You haven't got to travel the world on airplanes. So, make the most of that. But what we also have to ensure is that standards are available. So you can contribute, but also what we're then forced to use is relatively low cost for the SMEs. So while as big corporates may be able to absorb some of those costs of testing and other bits of standardization, we do need to ensure there's a fair market for Europe. Otherwise, we will not get that innovation. But picking up on the specific, do we test, don't we test? And I think the car example is a relatively interesting one, because you've got relatively high risk of death involved if you get it wrong, but it's a relatively closed ecosystem. So the actual number of threats and input to that AI, which Joachim describes as a module, is actually relatively low. So in that sense, you can probably test something fairly well, you know, stress testing, repeat testing. We are going to find different niches, different things will need different strategies. So, and I think the SMEs again are a good example of this. We need to ensure that all of those use cases, as Lindsay said, and all of the different niches are considered, because otherwise we will get, as you say, you get what you're given, and what you will be given is the Google large one-size-fits-all approach as they've dominated the standards. I noted earlier that there was one other group that looked at standardization security, largely in an ITU context, and that, I would argue, within the sort of realms of Europe, is the reason this has not got very far is because the big players have dominated. So using the EU funding and other things, again, I would really encourage all those on the call to think about, get involved, make sure that isn't the fate for these particular areas.
Yeah, okay, yeah, Sebastian, please.
Yeah, just picking up on Alex's last point. It's not a morally good or bad thing, but it's important to remember that large global companies thrive on large global markets. So from the perspective of a company like Google or Microsoft, it's of course easier if the whole world follows the same standards, or the kind of least common denominator standards. And they do not like European standardization because it is a hindrance to their business. It makes their business more complicated. And so they've got a fundamentally different business interest, which is of course something that is relevant for standardization work in Europe. So again, for SMEs working in particularly in a European scope, it's yet another reason to be involved in standardization. The other tendency that we see, and Google is a fairly good example, is that large corporations, in particular in the US, have got a different attitude towards aspects like safety or ethics. They say we take it seriously. They might even mean it. I'm not. I don't want to claim that they don't. They might even mean it. But they say we do it as an organization. So some of you might remember that Google tried to put together their own ethics panel because they said, yes, ethics is important. We have to think about it. We have to bring together people from a very broad variety of opinions and backgrounds, but we do it as Google. And we don't involve organizations or institutions or committees that are outside of Google or that kind of cover multiple companies. So there is a fundamental difference in the attitude, and we have to be quite mindful of that.
Yes, I think it's a very valid point, Sebastian, and I do see myself. I'm sitting in the board of Etsy and in other organizations that nowadays certain companies are so big and so powerful that they don't need standards anymore. They can set their own standards, and in this sector, in ICT in particular, this is happening. And I think there is a need, not just for SMEs, but also for all other companies, to use standards as a way to have, these ecosystems where, we can all work and compete on fair grounds. But are you, because you also represent a very important German association, BDE, that represents probably the core of European industry, at least in the electro machinery sector. Do you think there is enough attention and awareness from European industry that it is about time to invest in creating standards, because the standards can create an ecosystem which is interoperable, where they can all work. Because if they don't do so, it's going to be others who are going to set the standards, and there are companies who don't need European standards and don't need standards in general because they can set their own. Is there enough of this understanding out there, or not yet?
Well, I would want to distinguish between companies who are using AI and companies who are developing AI. For companies who are developing AI, I mean, Joachim is a perfect example. It's clear, or it's becoming more and more clear, that standardization is part of their business strategy and an important thing to be involved in. For companies who are using AI, or who have been told they should be considering using AI, the picture is quite different. Those companies tend to be involved in very well-established standardization activities. For example, for the whole group of standards around functional safety. And there are lots of issues under discussion there and under development there that have got nothing to do with AI. And you also haven't really got AI experts in their standardization committees. So one of the tasks of European standardization will be to build a bridge between AI experts and all those more established standardization committees that, should look at AI and should consider AI, but are not really yet equipped to do so. We actually see the same at an international level. So I'm also convener of the ICT 10, which is looking at standardizing AI ethics specifically, or ethics for autonomous systems and AI. And one of our conclusions there has been we need to basically create a handbook or a guidebook for other standardization committees. This is how you can consider and incorporate AI in your work, or AI ethics in this case, in your work.
This is a very important point, if I might add this for just one minute. There are two reasons why we at NERC wrote, the bulk of that standard. Number one is there aren't too many people aware of the issue of AI quality. Nobody really knows how to describe robustness or comprehensibility and how to quantify it. It's just because it's just so new to the market. But number two is also that the few people that do know about it, and the few people that work at Microsoft and Google and IBM and whatnot, they make about 120,000 euros a year, or dollars, whatever. And an organization does not easily send somebody with that kind of salary to a standardization committee, because you have to give, at the end of the day, everybody's going to ask you, what was your revenue this quarter, this year, this week, whatever. If you spend time in committees, there's not an immediate output. So you spend money on traveling, you spent the entire day there, and then you have to do your homework, you have to prepare for it. It's like every session is like a three days are basically gone for that company. And then if you add it up over the course of a year, that removes, I don't know, 15, 20% of somebody's entire, productivity. That is not coming back right away, because you cannot quantify the effect of your standardization work. That's a bit of a problem. And right now, everybody, every ML engineer is so sought after that they can ask for any ridiculous amount of money, and then a company doesn't want to spend that time in a committee. So that is a bit of a problem that we need to be aware of.
Yes, indeed. Let me also ask the participants in the webinar. There was Raynor Bass, who requested the floor to ask. He actually had two questions, if I'm not wrong. So I don't know if Raynor, you want to shoot your question or questions right now. Maybe, Raynor, you could also perhaps shortly introduce yourself, which organization you speak from.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. I have actually formerly worked at the ISO Central Secretariat for over 20 years, so I'm also a little bit familiar with standardization. I have two questions. My first question is, standards typically you can consider as public knowledge. Now you have in ICT, you have increasingly the use of patents and so on, and patents being quoted in standards, standards essential patents. And is this not a trend if you think about AI and other ICT applications becoming increasingly pervasive throughout standardization systems, that you have increasingly a mixture between public and private knowledge? And does this not, in the long term, possibly undermine the public standardization system of public available knowledge? Was my first question. My second question, which I'm personally even more interested in, is you talked about China and China's attempts to become a major player in AI, but also other technologies. Which approaches, from your knowledge, does China take in terms of developing, setting possibly AI standards? Is this through, let's say, trying to become a really leading technology provider and then trying to, in a sense, dominate standardization fora through the setting up of consortia, working through consortia, or simply through selling products on the market and gaining market dominance in certain markets at least, in order then so that this indirectly then also promotes through network effects the effect of Chinese standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raynor. Very good questions, by the way. Who wants to take the question about the role of IP, in particular the role of patents in, I know this is a tricky one. I'm sure Lindsay knows much about it because we have a lot of discussions about the IPR policy, especially in ETSI. So maybe Lindsay, you could say something about that.
Okay, just briefly, the policy in ETSI is a friend agreement. That is, if something is essential for usually an interoperability aspect in a specification, then the members are asked to make the licensing of it available to all at the same conditions. It doesn't mean free, but it does mean that it's an equal playing ground. And in my very old days in mobile telecom handset world, about 20 or 30% of the actual production cost of a mobile handset was in various licensing patent payments. So on the other hand, if you don't have the patents, then this information is trapped inside of a company and is not released, because then they have no commercial advantage out of it at all. So it's a balance between licensing something which is demonstrably the best, or some individual companies having very good products, but it's not available in the public domain for consideration and reuse. So it is a balance. Many people argue that having 70-year licenses and so on is rather ridiculous, but I think having a level playing field is probably the best balance we can achieve at this time. And it's better to know what you've put in than to buy something because the reputation at some time was very good. So it's better to know it than to guess it. Thanks.
Yeah. And anyone would like to take the question about how China is using standardization? Sebastian, yes.
Yeah, I can comment a little bit from a variety of perspectives. One wearing again my IEC SG 10 convener hat. This is actually also a dual convenership, and the colleague at the top of this committee is from China. And this is a very interesting constellation because we're talking about ethics, where everyone tends to say, oh, well, those Chinese, they don't care about ethics. That's actually not quite true. We've managed fairly well and fairly easily to identify the perspective that we need to take on ethics to be able to talk about it in a substantial way on an international perspective, even though there are people in the group from all over the world, ranging from China, Japan, the US, Saudi Arabia, various European countries, and so on. And we achieved that by saying, well, what do we talk about? We can't obviously standardize ethics in itself or values, but we're all talking about similar facets or similar concerns, things like privacy, transparency, explainability, and so on. Where we differ is how those properties become relevant in different application contexts and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So what we do in standardization is we standardize in two directions. We standardize the description of the ethical characteristics of an AI system, and we standardize the risk characteristics of the application context in which an AI system is to be used. Those two things can be standardized, and we've made pretty good progress in that committee. What we do not touch in standardization is which characteristics are acceptable in a given context, because that is a political decision. It's a decision that is different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, from country to country. So there is a very substantial amount of work you can do from a standardization perspective. From a more strategic perspective, China has woken up to the strategic relevance of standardization. So it shows in China sending more and more participants into international standardization bodies. So be it JTC1, SE42 for AI, and various other bodies. We also see that China is taking a more active role in the governance of international standardization organizations. So the new president of IEC is from China. Used to be the head of the Chinese State Grid Corporation. And we also see that China is taking an active role in many African countries, not just for sort of trying to do projects there and selling products, but also in terms of introducing their view and their way of creating standards. So I think it's a fairly complex situation. I can also comment it putting on my VDE hat. We've got a fairly close cooperation with various Chinese standardization organizations on things like Industry 4.0, but increasingly also in AI. And I would say it's like any business relationship. You try and find the common interests. At the same time, you're aware that you're also competitors in many ways, and it's always going to be a mix of both.
I'd like to just mention scalability again, because it came up earlier and some people made some remarks. To put it to a point, if Europe has many national approaches to how to use or how to measure the impact of AI, and there are, let's say, much more scaled with a bigger footprint solutions out there, then people and companies will automatically and by necessity use the footprint which has got the biggest scale, because they know they will then have the biggest outreach to the next person or the next company in the value chain. So we in Europe need to find a scalable set of standards which reduce the complexity of selling or moving data, services, and AI solutions, at least around Europe. Otherwise, we'll be, let's say, a little pygmy, or many little pygmies, and the elephants will be coming into our jungle. So the scalability from standards is absolutely important.
But especially when you think about SMEs taking advantage of this, very big potential market, which is the EU internal market. What standards do you think are actually missing in terms of AI? Do you have any concrete idea, or is it a too difficult question?
It is a difficult question. I've got a number of what can you say, a wish list, but it turns back to the question of the use case and the business area, in fact, for the people on the call today, because as has been mentioned, the automated vehicle system is one which has been under development for many years, and there may be a few pieces which people can point to very directly and say, oh, there's still something missing. But if you take a new area like personalized medicine, which is grown by huge amounts in the last 2 or 3 years, the amount of research is completely overwhelming what is possible to be crystallized or standardized, so that you can share information, for example, between hospitals or between a research lab and the individual and so on. So it really depends on the use case where something's missing. If you can bundle the use cases into a common family, then of course you can become a bit more scalable in your choice of standards. And I think Sensenlec do a very good job of that, I must say. In ETSI, we tend to try to be much more horizontal, and we say, look, here is a tool, a hammer or a screwdriver, use it where you like. And it tends to be, as I've noted in Sensenlec, much more, here is a cluster of potential users or industries. Let's make some standards for them. So I think you need to have a mix, but picking from which place is the most suitable for you is a tough question.
And when is that Sensenlec and ETSI will actually start cooperating actively in AI? Because obviously from an SME perspective, we'd like to reduce a little bit the fragmentation and the complexity. So is there any plans for at least having a joint group among the 3 organizations on AI, or are we going to see the usual situation?
We're in talks every week, okay? And I must say, all of my interactions have been between ETSI and Sensenlec have been very friendly and very helpful. The trouble is usually the devil is in the detail of the, what can you say, the administration laws or statutes and cooperation agreements and these things that we can here get together and have great ideas. But if we were all lawyers, we have quite different result out of this workshop. That's a key difficulty. But the intent and the understanding that it's really needed, that's on all sides.
I would actually strongly stress the same thing from a Sensenlec perspective. So there is a lot of goodwill going all the way to the very top of both organizations, and also, as Lindsay said, we have been in close contact for quite some time, and yeah, like Lindsay said, the devil is quite often in the statutes, because standardization is such a heavily formalized world. It's not easy to marry the Sensenlec process and structure world with the ETSI process and structure world, and maybe other SDOs as well. You mentioned IEEE at the beginning, which has the added complexity that it's not really clear, is it a European or an international or a US organization? And also ETSI as well as Sensenlec are tied into the international standardization standardization world of ITU, ISO and IEC. And then there are contracts between the European and the international level, which have an impact on how you can cooperate. So I think the short answer is yes, cooperation is already happening, and the long answer is that the lawyers have got a lot of work to do in the background to sort of give it the appropriate framework.
So ad hoc meetings like this one actually really help more than you might imagine, because you actually have people, let's say, exchanging ideas and also priorities in a way which would have to go up, down, and sideways to be done by formal means and liaisons and so on. So yeah, it's really, these are of value.
Absolutely, and
the easy workaround is always to have people participating in both worlds, because they don't hand in their brain when they leave one committee and go to the other. So that's always the easy workaround. But as soon as it comes to things like sharing draft documents, it gets a bit more complicated.
Yeah, and obviously I'd like to say that SBS is also a member of the European standardization family. We have a role also because the organization is recognized by the European regulation on standardization, and we are clearly very motivated in fostering this collaboration among all the parties, and we are part of the discussion. So we are very happy if this conversation in particular can help all of us to work for the same to go in a similar directions. Let me switch a little bit of topic, because we have been speaking about standards making. But when we speak about SMEs, we know there's going to be perhaps a small percentage of SMEs that can be active makers or drafters of standards, but there are many, many more who will actually be users of standards. Okay, and this is the very large majority of them will be just users, not makers. And here is something we are seeing more and more with new technologies, and AI is definitely one of them, which is the penetration of new technologies, the adoption of new technologies among SMEs is not always as good as we would hope it to be. Sometimes we have the standards which embed a lot of knowledge about new technologies, but somehow the SMEs are not always using these new technologies, and they're not even aware that they could use standards to adopt these new technologies. So do you think standardization organizations have a little bit of a, or even industry associations have some role in perhaps making those standards be more available to those SMEs, making them more knowledgeable about the existence of those standards, and perhaps adapting those standards a little bit more to make them even more usable by SMEs? Maybe I'll start with Sebastian, as you are in Seneca and also in this association, so you probably have a view on that.
Yes, yeah, you raised a few interesting points. If we look at SMEs using or possibly using AI, most SMEs that I speak to don't use AI because it's AI. They have problems to solve of maybe increasing efficiency or solving some technical issue, and if AI turns out to be the way to do it, then yes, they use AI, but AI is not a goal in itself for most SMEs. And so the relevance of AI standards for SMEs is an indirect one, because it brings the usual benefits of interoperability, but it also simplifies their lives, because it gives sort of a certain stamp of approval. If they have to buy an AI product, they know it's good enough because it conforms to X, Y, and Z standard, and they can assume it interoperates with maybe machines they've already got on their shop floor. So from my experience, or from the SMEs that I interact with, it's very much a pragmatic view of saying, well, yeah, AI is nice and well, but we treat it like any other technology, and we really look at what value does it bring us and how easy is it to integrate into operations.
So is there anything more that standardization bodies could be doing? Because you mentioned it's about a practical how to resolve issues rather than using AI per se, right? So isn't it that perhaps instead of just having standards that describe AI and so on, we will need to help SMEs with concrete use cases? What you can do if you have this problem, which technologies you can do, and how you can implement, how you can adopt different technologies to solve different problems. Am I right, or is it something that is completely out of?
You're fundamentally right that use cases and best practice is an excellent way of helping SMEs to make use of AI where it's relevant for them. And it's important that there are, in particular, government-funded or EU-funded activities to do that. I'm not sure that standardization plays a particularly big role. It's sort of a little bit outside the scope because very, very few SMEs will ever read a standard. It's not just true for AI. It's also true for very traditional things like electrical safety. Every SME uses all sorts of electrical devices, maybe some even very complex electrical devices, but no one ever reads a standard. They just look for, oh, is the machine I'm buying, is it certified against all the relevant standards, and that's good enough for me. I don't have to know what's inside the standard. So in a way, standardization is a service provider to SMEs, and not something. It's actually something that's almost in the background.
Lindsay or other,
Yes, I'd like to,
Alex or Joachim, do you have a view on that?
I'd like to comment on a big problem that affects everyone. That is the resources to look under the hood and see what's in a standard and really check, is it exactly what you need? Unless it's mandated by regulation, the choice is a very difficult one. You need to build up an expertise in an area in order to make that judgment yourself. And you could compare it to a Michelin restaurant guide. There's really no Michelin restaurant guide for standards unless you are going to, let's say, a safety organization who will tell you the top 10, etc. And particularly in AI, the number of, let's say, research ideas which are not yet even referenced or looked at inside standards is so huge that we are in a situation where the standards world is a small piece of the solutions world for AI. So even an SME saying, "Oh, I want the best standard," their competitor might say, "Oh, I already know a really good solution. It's not standardized yet, but I'm going to use that one." So we're in a bit of a, what can you say, not Wild West, well, maybe I will say Wild West situation at the moment. There may be a sheriff around, but he's usually in the next town, and you may look what the biggest cattle farm is doing and try to copy them, but actually having a good idea what's the best ecosystem for you as a let's say a farmer in the Wild West is a really, really tough problem just now. It's not stable.
Yeah, but I think we are in a far west, as you say, because we are talking about new technologies that are not yet commodities. When we speak about AI, but the same when we speak about big data, Internet of Things, or blockchain, or any of these new digital technologies that we would like many SMEs to use, so they are not commodities yet. If they were commodities, as an electrical device, as Sebastian said, okay, you will just make sure they comply with the standard, and then you can buy and use, switch, and plug and play, so to say. Here we are talking about a new set of technologies which are still evolving, and they're not really commodities, even if some of us would like to. And so in that respect, if we want European companies to embrace those technologies and really, innovate in whichever sector they are, the question is, where should these companies find the information? Yes, I agree, standards are not the source of everything. But in our experience, at least as an SME organization, we very often see other sectors who say, okay, we need to embrace technologies. Where do we find information? And very often they say, maybe this is going to be in standards. And of course, it's not that in standards they find everything, but maybe maybe they could find a little bit more if the standardization bodies will want to offer a little bit more guidance than what they have been doing for, Sebastian, yes, please.
Actually, you're putting your finger into an open wound there. We do have a bit of an let's call it explanation gap, because you've got people who create standards. They're engineers who are very, very deeply in the topic, be it AI, be it some other technology, and they love talking about minute details. So someone here said they're typically purists, and I can confirm that. And then they've produced the standard to their own satisfaction, and then they say, "Yep, we're done." The standard gets published. It is being understood basically by the people who contributed to writing it, but not by many other people.
Exactly.
And then it is only being read in addition to that by people who, for example, produce machines that need to be certified against that standard. But again, that's a very, very small number of people, and they only read the standards because they must. There isn't really, or not automatically, someone out there who says, "Well, I'll explain the content of this new standard or this new family of standards in a human readable way, or sort of in a way that is more journalistic, that is understandable to a broader technical audience, not the general public. That would be too far, but sort of a broader technical audience. That doesn't really exist, and there are some mechanisms. So, for example, if a standard becomes relevant for university teaching, then at some point over the years, it'll sort of, all the main ideas find their way into textbooks and into lectures, but that's a very long process. So I think the broader issue that there's a large body of complex technical information that is not being summarized, or that is not being curated for the casual user or the more casual technical audience. That's an issue that's not solved yet, and it goes back to that general observation that we as a society we generate, I don't know what the current figures are, probably twice as much information every year. It grows exponentially, but our capacity as individual human beings to understand and process this information is more or less constant. And I do agree with you that that's an issue that's not been solved yet for standards in general.
If I may add just one or two things.
Yes, please. I wanted to actually bring you into discussion.
Yeah. So number one is if you if you Google any technical issue, you will never, like, one of the Google results will not be a standard. I mean, maybe on page 27 there's a standard reference, like a sense standard or something. That's a bit of a problem. Number two is that if you try to find a quick answer on the NSB's website or on ISO's website or on SEN's website, it's also really hard to navigate your way to the right standard. And number three is that in order to do a little bit of an awareness building process, maybe the standardization organizations could tie news of, I don't know, accidents, incidents to technical standards, so that you can quickly analyze the news, what went wrong and why, and say, well, in the standard, blah 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 blah, we discussed this and we came up, or the committee came up with this and that way how to do, you drop your issue now here, whatever it is. And then you can always say, standards are created by committees of experts, international, European, whatever, and then to continually, spread the gospel there, and then, just raise awareness for what they are, how they are created, why they are so important. And because I mean, there's like news about technology every single minute, and you could tie it easily into those you know, stories.
Yeah, Lindsay.
Briefly, I think the marketing budget for most standards organizations is tiny. That's number one. And number two, the few times that we try to communicate with our users, we discover that the users don't have the time. So the mismatch between what we would like to communicate as standards people, the technical details, where to use something, how good or bad or mature it is, and the, let's say, the need for information from the end user. You know, is it ready yet? Where can I buy it? What guarantee is it? This mismatch is so huge that getting people together to get a good understanding from both sides is usually not working. So 1M2M, as an example, they got complaints for years that reading 800 pages of very, very difficult standardization text is not the way to promote a framework for IoT. And after many years, they got together a marketing budget and people to actually try to write an introduction and a tutorial and such things. So it does happen, but it's very slow. And I can say from my own groups, I mean, we've been working for 3 years on some standards, and only now do we start doing tutorials and so on.
But I must say, 1M2M, which you mentioned, Lindsay, is an excellent example, in my opinion, because you've seen lately the report from the chair of Smart M2M in the ETSI board. They reported that they are now working very fast in a new project, which is called the Smart Lift. So they have finally found one vertical industry, the lift, the elevators industry, which decided to use their own standard for IoT. And why is that? It is because we started a few years ago to talk with the European Association of SMEs in the lift sector, which is called the FESME, who had realized they had a problem. The problem was that the big multinationals were doing IoT lifts, whereas the SMEs were completely unable to do so. And the more the big multinationals were doing connected lifts, IoT using lifts, the less the SMEs could do maintenance and repair on those lifts, because they become a closed ecosystem, and the SMEs cannot work. So the SMEs understood that if they don't do themselves IoT lifts, they are out of the market. And luckily enough, they went to ETSI and they understood there was this important standard 1M2M. And now they are at the point where they are already doing, they have a 1M2M standard for smart lifts. And there are companies in the SME world which are producing in consortia IoT-enabled lifts. And this is a fantastic result, both for the SMEs and for ETSI, because it has shown that it can go into vertical sectors and it can actually produce, concrete results that are good for a larger community. And I have to remind that the 1M2M standards have been mainly produced with the efforts of the telecommunication industry, which understandably want to have IoT standards because there's a big market in the use of IoT. But then if SMEs do not use IoT, that market doesn't materialize, so to say. So perhaps we should be doing something similar with AI and with the other new technologies. But
what you
Alex,
pointed to is a very active group from the user side who were able to be focusing the discussions, and that's very important.
Are you raising your hand, Sebastian, or was it? Okay. Alex, I don't know if you wanted to intervene because you haven't, you have been silent for a while. Do you have a feeling about the adoption of AI in SMEs, especially if standards can help that adoption?
I think you have to go back to a point that Sebastian made some time ago, which is what are standards used for? So, and this also then plays back to the what ETSI and Sensenelec each do fairly well. So most people who are using AI, I agree with Sebastian, you end up using it because, Well, it arrived one morning, or you found actually it arrived last week and you just simply hadn't noticed. You're not developing and buying AI because it's AI. You are using AI because it solves some problem it's better at doing than the technology that went before it. So that's the first key point. So most SMEs, I think, are going to be users of technology rather than creators. However, there is going to be that second subclass of SMEs who wish to create and sell that underlying technology. So for them, standards are clearly going to be more important. But what I think you also have to bear in mind is that technology leads standards. Standards lag is horrendous in a lot of sectors. The other real challenge for Europe with this then is that AI is quite an accelerating technology, but it's been around in different forms of machine learning and big data and various other things for a long while. So we can write some standards, and I think certainly in the Sensenelec world, where they're strong, there is quite a gap in the framework standards that underline some of the ethics and other things. But you are never going to get framework standards that go through the European Union and through all the formal rigor to ever get ahead of technology. So the challenge, therefore, is how do we make standards faster, but also ensure quality? But on the education piece, again, this is sort of interesting because people who write standards generally write standards for a purpose. Again, Sebastian mentions the universities. We don't teach standards in university. What is evident as an aside, certainly from the IoT and the AI type spaces, when you look at security, is the mistakes people are now making with implementation of those systems are the same that people made in the late 90s in early OS windowed operating systems. You look at it and think, that's the same problem you did 30 years ago. It's just a new set of people. So clearly we're not educating. But you can't expect that to link through. What is good, though, are the white papers. Now, I do have to stress those out. Lindsay led the one for ETSI. They are the one tool that does educate very well. What we probably need to do as a community, and if the EU was able to enable some of that, or Sensenelec and ETSI, for example, were able to collaborate to do some more of those are actually the value in the education pieces. But sadly, as you pointed out, when you're paying people 120k a year, I might have to go away and have a think about that. You know, to work in this sort of field, I'm clearly in the wrong job. You're not going to get them to focus on writing textbooks and information, which is actually key to the European SMEs and others succeeding. You have to differentiate that between standards writing, which is the means to produce something and set best practice, and education. And that, I think, and Lindsay and Sebastian, I think you were both hinting on this as well, we somehow in Europe need to get better at that, because when you then flip it back to the Chinese approach, that is actually one of the things they do very, very well. That cross-tied up education, standards, long-term game, joining up industry and enablement, they do much better than we do. And clearly it is something we could learn from.
Right, I think that's a very interesting message. Yes, Sebastian.
And it actually, I very, very strongly agree with what you just said, Alex. I would take it one step further. We don't have very good funding mechanism for the production of good, concise, reliable, up-to-date information.
Yeah,
we've become used to the generation of information either being funded through advertising, where the interests of readers and of creators diverge rather wildly, or it's government funded, and we don't have good business models or good funding models for good, reliable technical information. In the old times, you might have called it technical journalism or textbook writing or this whole universe. It sort of happens haphazardly in the academic sector. If a professor happens to have an interest in writing a good review article on this or that, but there are very, very few organizations around that would pay for a good technical editor or a good technical journalist to produce good and concise and short text or briefing notes. And that is a fairly fundamental issue, and one that I think should be the subject of at least an EU call or funding program or something like that, because it's a worldwide problem and it holds us back in all sorts of issues.
I'm very glad that we are kind of reaching to some agreement or consensus on this point, because you probably are aware that the European Commission has announced that they will issue a new communication on standardization strategy, whereby, among other things, they want to concretely look at the digitization of industry. So how standardization can contribute to that. So perhaps that is the right point in time where, you know, such idea can be fed of creating, as you say, Sebastian, some funding mechanism to make sure we don't get just the new standards, but we also get the useful technical information prepared in a way which is digestible by as many companies as possible, and we kind of work together as an ecosystem, as maybe the Chinese are doing better than us. So we learn from the others, as Alex has been saying. Let me, because it's now 12:45, so we have a few other minutes where we have promised to have a discussion with the audience. So I wanted to give the floor to Omar Daer from the audience, because he signaled that he had a question. So Omar, if you can intervene, you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, correctly. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you for this interesting question, actually, to Lindsay, and maybe Joaquin can also comment on it. But my question is about the scalability. You talked about scalability and the importance for solutions to take up and be selected by people. Given that the European economy depends on SMEs, effectively, they produce competing and fragmented solutions. How do you see standards can help in creating this scalability for European SMEs to be able to compete with the big companies globally, or at least in Europe? Thank you.
Okay, I've got, first of all, it's not yet a developed commodity, as Stefano was saying. We should focus on some fundamental pieces. That is that AI relies on data. We should make sure that the data is, how do you call it, transportable, so that you may use it in one AI system today, but you may want to use it somewhere else when you see a more suitable system, or one which is better secured, or which is more explainable. So being able to reuse your data is very important. And the second thing is the interoperability. That is that maybe the result of one AI needs to be reused in the next one, or in a system for control. And you may not really care as a company what the AI is doing, as long as it works, but you want to be able to reuse that result. And the third thing is on the security side, that you look at the use case, at the application area, and apply, as Alex will tell us, some fundamental checks which can be done on practically all of the use cases, and see that the due diligence has been done. You can still be too late with too little, but you can avoid the let's say the obvious mistakes. And those three things, I think we can get standardized early, and we can, with those aspects, we can scale. And what is under the hood of how the AI works may be very much evolving in the next period. But if we have those pieces recognized and in place, I think we can, in all of our users of the AI, we can evolve with the technical solution.
Joachim.
But I give, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Sorry, no, Lindsay, sorry.
I just wanted to check with Omar if he found that reply helpful or inadequate, because we often have discussions.
He's still muted, so maybe yes, Omar.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think it you touched on interesting points there. I am aware that the technology is not yet up there, but I think we can also learn from previous experiences in older technologies like the operating systems, for example. I still find it interesting that Europe, for example, do not have one big company driving an operating system. The open source solutions are still, as I said, fragmented. No one is driving a force behind it to compete with the current operating systems yet there. So I think that standards can help in that, and I agree with your 3 points for AI. I look forward that this time we may find some sort of a solution that can come from Europe and be creative in a global arena. Thank you.
Joachim, I'm not sure if Omar also asked this question to you, if you wanted to comment.
Yeah, I would only like to add maybe one thing, regardless of the industry. I mean, we're primarily talking about AI and SMEs, but I think regardless of the industry, I think it is important that forums like SEN, like Etsy, they're open to SMEs. I believe the Etsy system is a little bit different, but it's essentially also open to SMEs. And because I know that there are a number of industry consortia that are not quite as open. I mean, they're open as long as you bring in a suitcase full of money, then that door opens. But the fact that you can enter SEN or SEN-like committee for a fraction of that amount, plus your travel costs and stuff, is like very, very important. And number 2 is I think it's really even more important that SEN and SEN-like they address topics that are on the horizon in time, because if you don't, I hate to say this, but you're becoming more and more irrelevant if there are other committees outside of SEN and outside of ISO, if they address these topics and just matter-of-factly set the standard, whether it's Google or IBM, or it doesn't even matter. That's why I think it's very important that, we were talking about marketing, that there's no marketing budget. I think that's a bit of a problem. And number 2, you need to do a little bit of like technology foresight, so that you know what is actually on the horizon, which companies are doing what, and how can we make sure that if there is a standard around it, there are opinions being put into that standard other than the opinions of the super large multinational corporations.
Yeah, that's a good angle, by the way. And I'd like to ask maybe Sebastian and Alex, how do you think we can make sure that the standards organizations and some like Etsy stay ahead of the developments? Because if obviously if we are only reactive, and if others go first, as Joachim said, this could be done in essentially in private consortia, where our companies, SMEs or even larger, may not have access. Sometimes you can pay, but sometimes you can't even pay to be in those consortia.
Well, the issue is actually well understood, and it's still a shock, both in SEN-like, but also at the ISO and IEC, that all the standards, or most of the standards on which the internet is founded, were developed outside of those established standardization organizations. They were developed at W3C and IETF and other organizations, nothing to do with ISO or IEC, and that's still a bit of a shock, even though it's quite a few years ago now. the other angle is apart from the obvious issue of marketing budget, of making sure that standardization work is efficient, that it is actually attractive and as time-saving as possible for experts to collaborate there, of having the right methodologies that make it attractive, the right tools, very bluntly. All that plays a role in making sure that if a bunch of experts want to standardize something and they consider, well, under which forum do we do it, then the established organizations like Sensenel and ETSI can make themselves attractive. But there is a second angle that I'd also like to stress, and that's the regulatory angle. Sensenel and ETSI have got a special status at least within the European Union, and there is also the new legislative framework, although it's not new anymore, but it's still called new legislative framework, that essentially allows the regulator to give a standard teeth by referring to it in official legislation. And that's a mechanism that's not available to other standardization forums or de facto consortia. So if Sensenel and ETSI manage to have a good cooperative working relationship with the Commission to make sure that regulation and standardization go hand in hand for those issues where both are relevant, then they can also ensure that these fora, where, as Joachim and Lindsay pointed out, you can enter without bringing a suitcase full of money, that these fora become and remain relevant.
Mm-hmm. All right, let me go back to the audience because I have to apologize with Daniele Tumietto because I must have overlooked his question earlier. So I don't know if Daniele, you are still in principle is still there. If you want to ask your question now, or it's you are unmuted, so whenever you want you can intervene. Besides that, as we are going towards the end of the time that we are given, I wanted to offer everyone a last chance, a last minute or so option to make your last statement, to summarize your views and your takeaways from the discussion. Where should I start from? Perhaps I will start from Lindsay, as I'm sure you have quite many ideas.
Okay, 1 minute. I think organizations like this one should try to create a small team who are able to devote more of their individual time to interact with the standards bodies which are already doing work which they can see is relevant, and get their voice more strongly heard. And that will automatically help to benefit that the results are closer to what the SMEs or maybe in smart manufacturing or maybe in autonomous vehicles are really wanting. All of us, so Sensenel and ETSI, have got individual companies involved and some alliances, but their voices could be stronger. And that, I would say, is the best. That the door is open, but there's not so many knocking on the door.
Right. I tend to agree with you, Lindsay. But
and it's not easy. Point. It's not easy, but okay, go ahead.
I can say this is essentially the job we at the Digital SME and at SBS are trying to do, and it's not always easy, even if we get a little bit of money to run our operations, to make sure that we are interesting enough for a very wide community of SMEs, because I know this by my experience. Our organization, Digital SME Alliance, we cover many different topics, and so we speak to many SMEs and associations of SMEs, but they tend to say, okay, standardization, okay, you can do it, but this is the least priority. There are many more things that are interesting for our members, and standardization we can do it because it is publicly supported. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to fund it. This is the sad reality. So there is much more, a lot of work to be done from that respect. So Lindsay, sorry to interrupt. Did you want to continue, or this was your last remark?
No, that's fine for now.
Okay, great. Maybe Sebastian, you want to go next?
Yes, first of all, thank you for bringing together this discussion and this panel. It's been quite useful, even though I know most of the faces on here, but it's always useful. And also thank you to the audience. The main point I would like to stress again is that standardization organizations must be mindful that they compete for a finite amount of attention, a finite amount of time of both the experts who are working in standardization and also the people who are supposed to use standards later on. And that might require a long, hard look at processes and tools and methods, and also collaborations, which I think is one of the more important tasks for standardization organizations. Thank you.
Thanks. Alex?
Yeah, so I think the most fundamental thing for me, and you can still I can sort of see the undertones in what Christian and Lindsay have been saying, is the EU view of standards for me is still very much driven by a monolithic, big heavyweight standards model. Now the ITF point is a very interesting one. The reason the ITF achieved what they did, and actually very, very quickly for the internet, is that they weren't encumbered by regulation or a number of other things. And therefore in specific technology rather than frameworks, they are very good. So one of the things that Europe does need to get a grip on is the difference between quality baseline standards that set a basic framework for regulation and the much more agile stuff. If you look to things like the open source communities, as they sort of say, well, they get there eventually. A few of the iterations might be poor in the interim, but the rate of creation of what is basically an open source, everybody can contribute, all online standard capability, the quality is lower, but it is agile. If Europe wishes to compete, and actually I think this is also where the Googles and the others do very well, is that West Coast collaborative model working online, and then Google buys up the small SMEs that have been working in it. We do have to get better at that, because yes, Etsy and Sensenelec compete, but interestingly, they are competing in versions of the 2 to 3 year standards creation track, not the fast agile stuff. And I think if we can manage to work out how we do that better, both in the stuff we are competing in and the stuff we should be doing, that would then give you the standards. And some of the stuff the more SME need requires that is closer to technology, sort of agility, rather than trying to standardize something that is already in the marketplace, which clearly takes longer.
Yeah. And finally, Joachim, I hope this time I managed to say your first name correctly.
Yeah, it was perfect.
Better late than never.
No, there really isn't too much for me to add here. It's all been said before, and I'm very, very grateful that I was being made part of this. So thank you very much for bringing all of us together. I think the thing that I just wanted to point out again is that I think it is important that Senelec, Sen and Senelec do invest a little bit in marketing activities, and making sure that people get aware of what the standards are, that they're actually there, and what they're there for, and that you do a little bit of like technology foresight to make sure that you start the process early and in an agile way, in order to make sure that it's not always the same larger corporations that set standards just by their pure force and market power. But thank you.
I'll take that advice home to the board.
Yes. Good point, Lindsay. I will also try to bring that into the board of ICT as much as possible. With that, if there is any burning question from the audience, feel free to raise your hand or use the chat. Otherwise, I think we should be concluding here. Before that, let me just try to summarize as much as possible the discussion of today. I'll be brief, but for me, the main we will, before I say that, we will also publish a summary report with the most important conclusions of the discussion today, the first and the second panel, and this will be shared first of all with all the speakers, so that you are able to comment on that before we make it public. From my point of view, but again, feel free to add anything, especially in writing, once we publish this report. The main points I'd like to take away is that there is very much an interest among SMEs for this concept of Europe's digital sovereignty. We have heard about this so-called third way to digitalization. So it's US and China have their own models. We can have our own model in Europe, whereby we very much focus on the European values, the European democracies, and we need to have some better digital sovereignty. We have seen also that, especially in these panels, the first and the second, we have among our SMEs, we have some who are able to be extremely innovative, extremely proactive, that have, they are very ahead, both in terms of quality of AI, but also in terms of ethics of AI, and with also concrete contributions to standardization. We have seen the issue of conformity assessment, whether it makes sense to apply an ex-ante conformity assessment, or if it is something, or if the safety and security of AI is something that should be checked even later. And there I took note of the example of the driving license that some of you made, which was very, very, very valid. We have to agree at a certain point that there is only some level of security and safety we can offer. And of course, as it was said by some of you, it is primarily up to the regulators and the legislators to find the right balance, decide what are the very critical applications, and decide the level of ex-ante scrutiny that we can offer. But there has to be some compromise, because everything in all senses is definitely not possible. And then also another important point was that we should perhaps learn a little bit from China and do much more in terms of linking our Earth standardization community with the industry and helping the industry to better adopt new technologies, developing, for instance, technical information guides especially for SMEs, but not only, to make sure that our SMEs and our industry in general adopts technologies. Of course, and then I took note of the last issues that all of you mentioned, Lindsay, the importance of representation of SMEs and the work of bodies like this. The issue of collaboration among different bodies that not only Sebastian brought forward, and the issue of agility versus quality brought forward by Alex, and finally, once again, the need to market the standards and to make sure they go ahead in technology for foresight, which Joachim repeated. With this, I would like to close the ICT Forum 2020 for SMEs in AI, for AI standardization. I would like to thank very much all the speakers and the audience who bear with us until now for this very long Monday morning. Wish all of you a great continuation, a great week, and stay safe. And we will let you know through digital means about how we follow up on this event. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Sebastiano.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.